You know what finally broke me? I was standing in my shop one Saturday morning, trying to cut a simple miter on a piece of white oak for a frame. I had the miter saw set up, made my cut, checked it with a square, and it was off by about half a degree. So I nudged the fence, made another cut, checked again, still off. 45 minutes later, I had a pile of offcuts, and I still didn't have a clean 45. And I'm standing there in this cloud of sawdust, ears ringing, thinking there has to be a better way. Turns out there is, and it's about 300 years old. I started studying how traditional shipwrights worked, the men who built naval vessels by hand in the 1700s and 1800s, and what I found completely changed how I work in my shop. These guys were faster, more precise, and more consistent than most of us are with $10,000 worth of machinery. Today, I'm going to walk you through 12 hand tool methods I picked up from studying these old shipyard techniques, and every single one of them outperforms the power tool alternative in speed, accuracy, or both. Plus, stick around to the end because I've got a bonus tip about a layout trick the old shipwrights used that I have never seen in a single modern woodworking book. Let's get into it. Traditional shipwright work is one of the most demanding forms of woodworking ever practiced. And what makes it so valuable to study today is that every single technique was developed under pressure, real deadlines, real consequences, and no electricity. Once you understand how these men thought about their tools, you start to realize how much we overcomplicate things in a modern shop. So let me give you some context before we dive into the methods. The shipwrights I've studied most closely worked in the British Royal Dockyards and the Scandinavian boatyards from roughly the late 1600s through the mid-1800s, places like Chatham, Portsmouth, and Deptford in England, and the coastal yards of Norway and Sweden. These weren't hobbyists. They were tradesmen building warships under contract, and the Admiralty didn't care about your excuses. A 74 gunship of the line used somewhere around 3,000 loads of timber, mostly English oak and elm, and it had to be built on schedule or heads rolled. So these men developed hand tool techniques that were brutally efficient. There was no time for fiddling. Every cut, every joint, every shaped timber had to be right the first time. And here's the part that really surprised me. They didn't achieve that speed by rushing. They achieved it by eliminating unnecessary steps. Their tools were simple, but perfectly maintained. Their jigs were crude, but incredibly effective. And their layout methods were so precise that the joinery practically cut itself. The guiding philosophy, if you could call it that, was this: never let the tool make a decision that your eye and your hand should be making. That sounds simple, but it runs directly against how most of us work today, where we set a fence or a stop and trust the machine to be accurate. The shipwrights trusted themselves, and they had the methods to back it up. The first method is shooting a perfect miter with a hand plane and a simple wooden jig. This is the one that started my whole journey into shipwright techniques because it solved the exact problem I described at the beginning. Here's what the old shipwrights did and what traditional boat builders still do today. You take a piece of dense hardwood, something like beech or maple, and you make a shooting board with a 45-degree fence. The workpiece sits against the fence, and you run a hand plane on its side along a flat track. I use a number 7 jointer plane for this because the long sole keeps the cut dead straight. You take one pass, check it with a combination square, and 9 times out of 10, it's perfect. The whole operation takes about 30 seconds once the jig is built. Compare that to fussing with a miter saw where the detent might be off, the blade might have a tiny wobble, or the fence might have shifted. The shooting board doesn't drift. It doesn't vibrate. It doesn't need to be recalibrated. You build it once, and it gives you a perfect miter every single time. When I first tried this, I checked the resulting joint with a machinist's square, and there was no light anywhere along the line. I just stood there thinking about all the time I'd wasted fighting my miter saw. The second method is cutting a precise scarf joint with a handsaw and a slick. In shipbuilding, scarf joints were everywhere. When you need a keel timber 40 feet long and your oak only comes in 20-foot lengths, you scarf them together. The joint has to be perfect because the structural integrity of the entire vessel depends on it. The old shipwrights would lay out the scarf with a marking gauge, typically at a ratio of 12:1, meaning for every inch of timber thickness, the scarf runs 12 inches long. They'd make the initial cuts with a large handsaw, then come in with a slick, which is essentially a wide chisel about 3 inches across with a long handle, and pare the surface flat. A slick is one of the most underappreciated tools in woodworking. You push it with your body weight, not a mallet, and it removes a thin, controlled shaving that leaves a surface so flat you could check it with a straight edge and see no light. When I tried doing the same joint on a table saw with a tapering jig, it took me 3 times as long to set up. The surface had saw marks that needed to be cleaned up, and the fit wasn't as good. The hand saw and slick method was faster from start to finish and produced a better result. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or just use the first link in the description. Alright, let us keep going. The third method is rapid curve shaping with an adze. This is the one that really made my jaw drop. In the shipyard, frames and knees had complex, sweeping curves that had to match templates precisely. The shipwrights would rough out these shapes with a hand adze, and a skilled man could shape a futtock. That's a curved frame timber in 15 or 20 minutes. I watched a traditional boat builder do this at a heritage yard in Maine, and he was removing wood faster than a bandsaw could have cut the profile, with no setup time, no blade changes, and no burning. The adze he was using had about a 4-inch wide blade with a gentle sweep to the cutting edge, and he swung it in short controlled arcs, reading the grain as he went. The key is that the adze doesn't fight the grain the way a bandsaw blade does. You're working with the wood's natural structure, splitting fibers cleanly instead of tearing through them. When he was done, the surface only needed a few passes with a spoke shave to be fair and smooth. If I had tried that same curve on my bandsaw, I'd have spent 10 minutes setting up, 5 minutes cutting, and another 20 minutes cleaning up the saw marks and getting the curve fair. The adze got there in less time with a better result. The fourth method is truing an edge faster than a jointer with a long hand plane. The shipwrights had to fit plank edges together for the hull, and those edges had to be dead straight over lengths of 12, 15, even 20 feet. They used long trying planes, some of them 24 inches or longer, and they could true an edge in a few passes. I use a number 7 jointer plane for boards up to about 4 feet, and I can get a straighter edge than my 6-inch power joiner produces, especially on longer stock. The reason is simple. A long hand plane bridges over any dips or hollows and only cuts the high spots. A power jointer only references the short length of its tables, so any rock or twist in the board gets transferred. On anything longer than about 3 feet, the hand plane wins on accuracy every time, and there's no setup. The fifth method is fitting a rabbet with a shoulder plane instead of a router table. In planking a hull, rabbets were cut constantly to receive the garboard strake and other planking. The shipwrights used rabbet planes and shoulder planes to sneak up on a perfect fit. When I switched to using a shoulder plane for fitting rabbets on cabinet backs and drawer bottoms, the difference in quality was immediate. You take light passes, check the fit, take another pass. There's no tear out, no burning, and you can adjust the depth by thousandths of an inch. Try doing that on a router table. You're either taking another pass and hoping you don't overshoot, or you're shimming and fussing with the fence. The shoulder plane gives you complete control. The sixth method is chopping a clean mortise with a brace and chisel instead of a hollow chisel mortiser. The shipwrights bored out the waist with a brace and bit, then squared up the walls with a mortise chisel. When I tried this side by side against my benchtop mortiser on a piece of white oak, the hand method took about 2 minutes longer on a single mortise. But the walls were cleaner, the corners were sharper, and I didn't have to deal with the machine bogging down in hard grain. On a project with 4 or 5 mortises, the time difference disappears entirely once you factor in setup and adjustment. The seventh method is beveling plank edges with a draw knife and spoke shave. Hull planks often needed beveled edges to fit tightly against the curved frames. The shipwrights would clamp the plank in a shaving horse or against a beam and use a draw knife for heavy removal, then follow up with a spoke shave to refine the angle. I've adopted this for any time I need a consistent bevel along a long edge. It's faster than tilting a table saw blade and running a long board through, and you can adjust the angle continuously along the length, which is something no machine can do easily. The draw knife I use has an 8-inch blade, and with a freshly honed edge, it peels off ribbons of white oak like butter. The 8th method is using a marking gauge and knife wall for layout, instead of measuring and marking with a pencil and tape. The shipwrights rarely measured in the way we think of measuring. They used dividers, marking gauges, and story sticks to transfer dimensions directly from one piece to another. When you set a marking gauge and scribe a line, that line is exactly the same every time you use it. No reading errors, no parallax, no wondering if you're on the right side of the pencil line. I switched to knife wall layout about 5 years ago after studying these methods, and my joinery improved overnight. The knife line gives you a tiny trench that your chisel or saw registers into perfectly. It's faster than measuring and more accurate. The 9th method is trimming end grain flush with a block plane instead of a belt sander. When the shipwrights needed to flush up a through tenon or a tree nail, they reached for a block plane set to a fine cut. On end grain, a sharp, low-angle block plane at about 12 degrees of effective cutting angle produces a surface that looks almost polished. A belt sander on the same end grain leaves scratch marks and tends to round over the surrounding surface. I keep a low-angle block plane set with a blade honed to 8,000 grit, and it handles flush trimming in seconds with no dust and no risk of oversanding. The 10th method is boring angled holes with a brace and bit instead of building a drill press jig. The shipwrights drove tree nails and fasteners at compound angles all day long, and they did it by eye with a brace. The trick is to sight along 2 planes simultaneously, which sounds hard but becomes second nature with practice. I use a brace with a 2-inch lead screw auger bit for draw boring, and I can set an angle faster than I could clamp up a tilting drill press table and verify it with a bevel gauge. The brace also gives you tactile feedback that tells you exactly what the bit is doing inside the wood, something no power drill can match. The 11th method is flattening a wide panel with winding sticks and a scrub plane. When the shipwrights needed a flat surface on a wide timber, they used winding sticks, which are just 2 straight parallel sticks placed across the board to identify twist. Then they removed the high spots with a scrub plane, which has a heavily cambered iron that takes thick shavings fast. I flatten panels up to about 24 inches wide this way, and it's genuinely faster than running them through a planer when you account for the time spent removing snipe, dealing with tear out, and making multiple passes to get below the deepest defect. The scrub plane doesn't care about grain direction the way a thickness planer does, and winding sticks show you exactly where the problem is. The 12th method is pairing a tenon cheek to a perfect fit with a wide chisel. The shipwrights cut tenons slightly oversized and then paired to a snug fit using a wide bench chisel, typically 1.5 to 2 inches across, with the back dead flat and the bevel honed razor sharp. You lay the chisel flat on the cheek, bevel up, and push with controlled hand pressure. Each pass removes a gossamer shaving, and you check the fit after every 2 or 3 passes. The result is a joint that slides together with firm hand pressure and has full contact across the cheek. No machine can give you that level of fit because no machine lets you feel when you're there. Now, let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that the shipwright approach handles completely differently. No judgment here. I did all of these for longer than I'd like to admit. The first pattern is defaulting to power tools for every operation. Most of us walk into the shop and flip on a machine without even considering whether a hand tool would be faster. I did this for decades, but what I learned from studying shipwright methods is that setup time is the hidden cost of power tools. For a single cut, a single joint, or a single shaping operation, the hand tool is almost always faster when you include the time spent setting up, adjusting, testing, and cleaning up. The second pattern is relying on measurements instead of direct transfer. I used to measure everything with a tape measure and a pencil, and I'd wonder why my joints had tiny gaps. The shipwrights almost never measured that way. They transferred dimensions directly with gauges and dividers, and their work was more accurate because of it. The third pattern is sanding everything. Most of us reach for sandpaper as the default finishing step, but sanding actually tears wood fibers and leaves a rougher surface at the microscopic level than a sharp cutting edge does. The shipwrights finished surfaces with planes and scrapers, and those surfaces held up better under finish because the fibers were cleanly severed instead of torn. The fourth pattern is overcomplicating jigs. I used to build elaborate jigs with toggle clamps and micro adjusters when a simple wooden fence screwed to a board would have done the same job. The shipwrights built jigs that took 5 minutes to make and lasted for years. Simple works. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is a layout technique I picked up from studying how shipwrights marked out mortise and tenon joints on large timbers, and it's so simple it almost feels like cheating. Instead of measuring the width and depth of a mortise and then transferring those measurements to the timber, the shipwrights would take the actual tenon, hold it against the face of the receiving timber, and scribe directly around it with a marking knife. Then they'd set their marking gauge to the tenon's thickness by pressing the gauge against the tenon itself, never reading a number. Every dimension was taken from the actual mating piece, not from a ruler. I started doing this about 3 years ago, and my tenon fits went from good to nearly perfect overnight. The reason is obvious when you think about it. When you measure with a ruler, you introduce at least 2 opportunities for error, one when you read the measurement and one when you mark it. When you transfer directly from the mating piece, there's 0 opportunity for error. The pieces are self-referencing. It works for any joint where 2 pieces need to fit together, dovetails, bridle joints, half laps, you name it. Try it on your next project and see what happens. Before you head out, I want to make sure you know about my book, Secrets of the Shipyard. It goes way deeper than any single video can, with 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques, 25 hand-drawn illustrations, and 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. If you want to bring these old shipwright methods into your own shop, this is the guide to do it. Just scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description to get your copy. Thanks for spending time with me today, and if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next one.